Good morning, everyone. How are y'all doing this morning? Thank you. Mary, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here at this event that is being sponsored by the Alliance for Housing Solution and held in this very cool space, frankly. I get a chance to do a lot of talks, and this is the coolest space that I've ever actually been able to speak in. So, I have this chance to come out and talk about this research that we've done at the Center for Regional Analysis quite a bit, and I've seen a lot of you before. So I'm hoping that what we can do is have this be the basis for a conversation that will follow with our panelists to think really critically about this link between housing and economic development. For many of you, housing is not only a profession, but also a passion. And so I think taking it this next step to thinking through how housing links to economic growth for those who think about things a little bit differently than maybe some of the housing professionals in the room. So by way of introduction, we started thinking about this research project because at the Center for Regional Analysis, we focus on three main issues: on transportation, on housing, and on economic development issues in the greater Washington area. And it became clearer and clearer that these three issues were all very closely linked. And so, we knew this idea, we had this sense that housing and economic growth were linked, but the more we thought about it, we knew that it wasn't just a housing issue and an economic development issue, but it's a traffic issue and it's a transportation issue. And this idea of making people think about housing in a slightly different way was part of the mission of this study. Right now, we have 250,000 people who live outside the Washington area and commute in every single day, 250,000 people. Who live in West Virginia, who live on the Eastern Shore, who live in Richmond, and commute inside to jobs here in the region. We have hundreds of thousands more who live in one jurisdiction and work in another. They live in Spotsylvania, they commute to DC, they live in PG, and they commute to Arlington. And so this idea of traffic and transit and having resources to spend on transportation is really the flip side of having sufficient housing in the places where workers work. And so we wanted to bring these two issues together. What we find when we think about this issue is that, without sufficient housing in the region, and, at prices and rents and in the right locations that meet the needs of the workers in the region, the economic vitality of the Washington area is at risk. And when we did this study last fall, these issues were true, but I think it's even more true now. As the region faces changing economic structure, changing relationships with the federal government, different regions across the country with economies that are growing faster than ours right now, this issue of the importance of housing in the region, I think, is even more important now than it has been before. Without sufficient housing, workers will find it increasingly hard to live in places close to their jobs, and traffic and transit will worsen. Businesses will be affected, not only by less productive workers who are caught in traffic every day or are trying to get out a little bit early in the afternoon to beat the traffic, but by the difficulty in retaining workers, folks who currently work for them and are making that calculus of we need to move up, but we also could get a job in Lexington or Houston or Austin or Seattle or places where it's a little bit less expensive. So retaining workers becomes an issue related to housing, and then attracting workers. When businesses go out to seek workers from other parts of the country, workers have sticker shock when they come here to some places in the Washington area. And so workers now have choices. They didn't have as many choices a couple years ago. Washington was the only place where jobs were growing. But now there's places that workers can choose to go where housing costs are less. So businesses may decide to expand or relocate in other places, and that would be that would cause a slowdown in our economic growth here. And frankly, all of us would be affected. And I think this is part of the conversation that I'd like to have, is that even those of us who have a place to live or are able to live close to where they work, this idea of less economic diversity, fewer workers who are working in personal services, dry cleaners and convenience stores and restaurants, because the wages that are needed to pay folks enough to live in the region are going to be, higher and higher. So we'll have longer commutes, we'll have fewer local services, and these are issues that are important not just to affordable housing advocates, but frankly to the entire community in the Washington area. So we asked these three questions. And these issues were really the drivers of the housing demand study we completed last fall. So how much housing will be needed to meet the needs of the net new workers over the next 20 years. What types of housing will be needed, the owner-renter split, multifamily versus single family, and where in the region will this housing need to go. So this is the approach we took, and it really is a jobs-driven demand approach. And so by that fact, it doesn't get at everybody, right? It's just a piece of the housing need. But when you're trying to, as we think about linking economic growth and housing, starting with jobs was where we wanted to start the conversation. So we started with jobs, and we used some econometric models from Global Insight to anticipate the number of net new jobs that will be coming to the greater Washington area over the next 20 years. So by those estimates, there'll be a little over 1 million net new jobs in the Washington area between now and 2030. Those are new jobs. Those are jobs that don't exist now. In addition to that, there'll be 1.8 million replacement jobs in the region. That is 1.8 people working currently in the region who will be retiring or who will be switching out of jobs, and people will come in and replace those workers. And many of them will need housing because as my boss likes to say, when he retires, he's not giving up his house. And so a lot of these folks who come in to take jobs as replacement workers will also need housing. So I say that for two reasons. One, I think this jobs number is high now. This million net new jobs number is high because these estimates were done before the full effect of the recession. But second, even if they're high, they're still not covering everything because they're not covering replacement workers. They're not covering folks who want to live here because they want to be here. They're not covering the housing needed for very low-income folks who are not in the workforce. So even though I think the starting number is high now, I don't think it's, in some ways, it's not high enough when we talk about the numbers of housing that will be needed. So we started here, and you can see I've put up the information for Northern Virginia, suburban Maryland. Suburban Maryland includes Montgomery, Prince George's, Frederick, Charles, and Calvert. Northern Virginia includes an area that extends as far down as Spotsylvania, Stafford. That's our region, right? It's defined by the federal government. But I've also put up Arlington and Alexandria numbers. I know we're here in Arlington County, and I know that we had some folks from the city of Alexandria. So I put up the numbers for both places. I work here in Arlington. I live in Arlandria, right over the border in Alexandria, so I'm always interested in seeing the Arlington and Alexandria numbers. So there's going to be significant job growth here in Arlington and Alexandria as well as across the region, and these are the kinds of jobs. This was one of the major inputs to our housing demand studies. What kinds of jobs are coming to the region because there's certain wages associated with different kinds of jobs. So we can see these are the types of jobs that are coming. The professional and business services sector is the largest sector in the Washington area. It also has among the highest wages, so you can see the median wages there in the last column. But lots of other jobs are coming to the region that support our economy in a variety of different ways. And some of them come with wages that are far below the area median income, and that are what's going to be one of the drivers of the types and the prices of housing that will be needed. So you can see leisure and hospitality, the median wage $23,500, construction sector, education and health services, and so on. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this methodology slide, but the report, just for those who are interested, is on our website, and there's lots of details about these methods. But what I want to highlight is, as we start with jobs for these housing demand numbers, we thought through all the things that affect the types and the prices of housing that people would need. And the types of housing that people need depends on age, right? The age of the workers depends on the household structure, whether there's children in the household or not, and depends on household income. So those are the three main inputs that we used. And at the end of it, we then had the amount of housing that would be needed in each jurisdiction in the Washington area if they were to house all of their new workers over the next 20 years, right? So that's the goal. If you house all your workers over the next 20 years in your jurisdiction, that would keep traffic levels constant, right? They're already bad. They wouldn't get any worse, though. That would keep inter-jurisdiction commuting relatively constant, and then it would start to drop off. That's not realistic, though, right? So it doesn't always make sense that we're going to house all of our workers, even though that's a target that we use as sort of a benchmark. There's two-worker households. Not everybody works in the same jurisdiction. There's preferences people have for living in different places and so on. So we also developed a set of forecasts that use the current in-commuting rates. That is, whatever share of the jurisdiction's workers in commute now, we assumed all the new workers would be accommodated at that in commuting rate. That means more traffic. That means by the end of the forecast period, instead of 250,000 people commuting from outside the region, it would be 700,000 people. That's impossible. I mean, it would be an untenable situation. So we report them out knowing that each jurisdiction really does need to house a greater share of their workers over the next 20 years. So here's some of the basic numbers here. So as I mentioned, the region's expected to add over 1 million new workers, net new jobs over the next 20 years, which generates demand for nearly 750,000 housing units, net new housing units over the next 20 years. You can see how it splits out. These are, again, remember, there's, sort of accommodate workers. In Arlington, the need is for a little over 34,000 housing units over the next 20 years. And in Alexandria, it's 31,000 housing units over the next 20 years. And so, how have we been doing? This shows the metro, right? And this shows the number of building permits each year for the last 20 years. So between 1992 and 2011, on average, there were building permits for 28,650 housing units in the metro-wide, 22 jurisdictions metro-wide. If we're going to meet the need suggested by these forecasts over the next 18 years, we need to issue and start construction on nearly 38,000 housing units every year for the next 18 years. And we were, you see that big spike up there, right? That's the housing boom when there was a lot of construction going on, but we're coming off the lowest level of residential building activity in the metro and in the nation that we've ever seen. And so getting back up to this 37.7 is possible, certainly given where we've been before, but we're far from it at this point. When you look at Arlington and Alexandria, Arlington's in orange, Alexandria's in green. And so over the 20-year period I mentioned before, Arlington produced a little under 1,000 units a year, at least measured by building permit activity. I put up the 2002, the last 10 years, because activity picked up a bit. When you look at the next 18 years, though, these forecasts suggest a need for 18 new housing units a year in Arlington County to meet the demand suggested by these forecasts to accommodate all the new workers in the county. You can see similar for Alexandria. Building activity has been a little bit lower in Alexandria, but certainly in the last 10 years. And so there's a need for 1,700 new housing units every year for the next 18 years to meet the future demand. Not only is there a demand for housing, and these numbers sort of talk about the extent to which we need to increase the amount of residential development in the region, but there's also a pretty significant shift in the types of housing that will be demanded by new workers over the next 20 years. And this shift is driven by the fact that these workers coming into the region will be younger. They'll be coming in at entry-level salaries, and so their wages will be lower. They'll be delaying marriage and childbearing, so they'll have smaller household sizes. And so those factors, accompanied by the locations of jobs over the next 20 years, really drive the shift in the types of housing that will be demanded. Region-wide, about 2/3 of the housing stock is single-family, but when you look at the demand that will be generated by the net new workers, it's flipped, that the demand will be about 40% for single family and about 61% for multifamily. You can see how that plays out in some of the inner jurisdictions in Arlington and Alexandria, where when you look at the demand for housing, it's predominantly a demand for multifamily housing. And again, it's driven by those demographic factors that I mentioned. And it's not to say that these folks won't move into single family ultimately, but the initial demand for housing is suggested much more multifamily than we currently have on the ground. So I have 4 sets of pie charts coming up. So, this is Arlington County, and what the pie chart on the right says is of the owner-occupied units. So these forecasts suggest a need for about 15,000 owner-occupied units in the county over the next 20 years. This pie chart on the right shows, given the incomes and the household structure, what I mean by that is how many workers per household, these are the prices at which housing, owner-occupied housing is affordable using standard assumptions about affordability. So you can see under 200,000, 200 to 400,000, and so on. The pie chart on the left then is basically what's on the ground in terms of the owner-occupied stock in Arlington County, based on sales data for 2012. And so, the thing that strikes me the most here is that we're going to need a lot fewer 600,000 plus owner-occupied housing over the next 20 years. And so I don't think that comes as any surprise, but I think that for a while that's a lot of what was being built. Maybe not here in Arlington County, but particularly in the outside areas of Northern Virginia. As far as rental housing goes, again, the needed for new workers is on the right, and I'm looking in particular at the fact that for the workers in Arlington County, about a third will be able to afford rents less than $12.50 using standard, assumptions about affordability. I was surprised. Can I say I was surprised that the current stock of housing in Arlington County has a third of the rental stock is priced in this range. This is the stock that's at risk, and so one of the policy implications of this is we're not going to build all this housing. Right? But so it emphasizes the need to preserve what we have on the ground, and to, when we are building, to think about the fact that the need for rents above $22.50 is already being met by the existing units that are on the ground. These data on the left are only through 2010, so anything that's been built here in the county between 2010 and 2012, those rents, and I know you can kind of see what's been built in the last couple of years or what's under construction, aren't accounted for here. Quickly, similar then for the city of Alexandria. On the right is the sort of price points for owner-occupied units that these demand forecasts suggest, and then on the left, a similar split in terms of the current stock of houses priced above $600,000 compared with the need. And then when you look at the workers and the age structure and the wage structure in the city of Alexandria, nearly half of the net new workers moving into the region and taking jobs in the city of Alexandria will be working in jobs, will be in households where household incomes suggest a need for rents below $12.50. Half of the workers in the jobs in Alexandria. And you can see what the current stock is there on the left. So in conclusion, and I didn't bring my slides up here with me, which is why I'm bending over to read these things. So when you look at what's being planned by many jurisdictions, particularly when we look sort of at some of the further out jurisdictions, that the plans include an insufficient supply of housing, given what these forecasts suggest. There's going to be a greater need for multifamily housing than we have seen, than we currently have on the ground. And that when we think about this idea of housing, to think about how it affects the jurisdiction's local economy, how it affects our regional economy, how it affects our quality of life in terms of availability of services, diversity of economic activity, ease of transportation and commuting, it becomes an issue that all of us should be concerned with, and not just affordable housing advocates. So I'm happy to have this conversation with as many groups as possible, particularly when we have the business community with us, and sort of getting their impressions on whether and how they see housing affecting, maybe their bottom line, affecting their ability to be profitable, because they are businesses, and how their role in the affordable housing discussion is becoming even more important, as we move into this next stage of our economic growth. I'm going to leave it here and suggest that if you are interested in looking at the whole report, it's available on our website. And I think that I have time to take a couple of questions, but I'd like to just take a few so that we can hear from the other panelists and have more of a discussion. So I'll end it there, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to take some. Or thoughts, or reactions. Yes, sir.
With 1 million jobs and 700,000 or so units, that really does suggest very small households. Like 1.25 persons per unit.
Workers per unit. Mm-hmm.
Per unit. So, would you not expect that there would be, given the types of jobs that are coming in, that there'd be more doubling up? That given the number of jobs, the number of 700,000 units really seems large to me.
Yeah.
Given land costs, construction costs, rents that are demanded.
Yep. Yeah, so this question of, sort of these numbers suggest pretty small household sizes, and this idea of, and there's constraints on land, and it's expensive to build, so this idea of 750,000 housing units sounds very difficult to achieve. Wouldn't people make accommodation, right? And so exactly, and that's what they're doing now. We don't assume any accommodation, though. What we wanted to do was say, well, here's the big number, and we wanted people to think about this number, that it is big. And it's not the right number, right? So but it's this idea of thinking about what we would need if we wanted people to be able to have sufficient housing. By sufficient, it not only means affordable, but what we did was we took current trends on the household structure of folks. We didn't assume any over doubling up. We assumed labor force participation rates stayed pretty constant, which means that it's 1.25 workers, but it's more people per household because we have some people who don't work, and so so I think what you're getting at is two issues: is that will people make accommodation, and the answer is maybe, or they may move somewhere else, right? Another region. They may go somewhere else. We're a pretty mobile labor force nowadays. And then the second question is this number even feasible? Well, I think that's part of the discussion, right? I think that's part of the discussion, and it's a local jurisdiction starting point for that discussion. And we did some follow-up research that looked at the process for getting residential development built in the jurisdiction across the region, and we put out detailed reports for Fairfax County and Montgomery County. So it sort of goes through the process and some of the steps and the fees and proffers associated with residential development to sort of get a sense for what the process was to get these units built on the ground. So yes, sir.
The link seems to be very specific to proximity and to jobs. And certainly we know there's been a shift in the kinds of work and employment that we're doing in the U.S. The analysis you've done really draws on issues of transportation and transit, the mobility portion of that. It would seem that maybe now is a good time to start to ask ourselves, because maybe the larger question is one of access. Would not a new methodology or set of methodologies bringing broadband infrastructure into the discussion become relevant at this time to help find a balanced approach to how do we localize job opportunities and start to offset some of these demographic shifts?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought this up, this other infrastructure, right? This broadband infrastructure that would allow us to do our work in different places so that maybe we aren't on the roads or we aren't commuting, and that, as I'm talking about here, locating housing near jobs, you're suggesting maybe having the employment done closer to where housing is more affordable to build, maybe. And that tangentially gets to this issue of telecommuting, which is one part of that. I think there's this issue of telecommuting, and there's also this issue of job movement. I really feel like, unfortunately, of many of the regions across the country, we are less well-suited to spread our jobs out than other places. And I say that, and we're less well-suited for teleworking than in other places. And I say that because we have a pretty centralized employment district here in the Washington area because of the presence of the federal government. We also have a culture of, in our main employment activities, of face-to-face contact. That's not going away anytime soon. And so this idea of thinking about housing more broadly outside the area of transportation infrastructure and this broadband infrastructure, I think is certainly has to be part of the conversation. But I'm not sure it's in our 20-year horizon to make a lot of efforts on that front.
And aren't we somewhat limiting ourselves to how we've used these broadband technologies in the past, this jargon of telework, and left out of the equation new methodologies, new approaches, new structural approaches to doing this?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely, I think it has to be part of the conversation. We are slow adapters here in Washington. Okay, good. I'm going to turn it over to the panel now. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to hearing from our